The Deposition from the Cross by Roger van der Weyden. There isn't very much depth in this painting. It's almost like a relief about 3 feet deep. But the very complex arrangement of figures is structured on a series of circles. The first, you can see, follows the outside edge of St. John on the left and curves around Christ's body with Mary at the center of the circle. The second circle runs along the front of the figure holding Mary, around the side of her head, following the folds of her dress, the curve of the garment of the man in the richly decorated cloak, along Christ's arm, and through the eyes of the figure holding Christ, Joseph, and the man holding Mary. The third follows the fallen arm of Christ, joins Mary's hand, continues around the figure of Mary Magdalene on the right-hand side along her dress and back, and along the tops of the heads of the two figures and along Christ's raised arm. The fourth runs through the eyes of the figure holding Mary, passes along Mary's head, and goes along through the passages of light shining through the figures, around past the break at Christ's knees, in front of Mary Magdalene's head on the right, and the center of the circle falls on the line created by the vertical of the cross and the horizontal lintel behind the figures. Again, this is a very complex structure. None of this was accidental in order to make sure structure also before we start. The next section is very graphic. It shows how very sensitive good painters are. We're brought from the foreground along the river, pulled towards the background down the creek. You can see how our attention is just pulled back that way in the background. Then we're moved up into that little patch of dark trees above. We're brought back to all the shadows below, down the trees, along these couple of darks in the bank to this little bush which diverts our attention back into the painting. And that's how Levitan has structured it. Now there's a secondary movement also, which again will pull us back down the river in the same way. Our attention is pulled towards the back. But this time there's a dark just up there to the right. Our attention is then pulled across the clouds back to that dark, down the birch trees, along the field, those little darks, back to the bush and back into the painting. And he's very consciously creating these structures for our eye to move. We get such a feel of all the parts adding up to a coherent whole in this painting. Look at the bush that we said was diverting our attention in the bottom of the painting back up the river. And look what happens when that one little piece is removed. You can see now how the eye is actually brought out of the painting, is diverted out of the painting with that bush gone. And yet when it reappears, we can see its role in just furthering our eye through the picture plane rather than out of it. Whenever we want the eye to be pulled into a part of the painting, we can use gradation, the way Levitan has done here with the creek. But look what happens when we reduce that gradation. You see how flat the shape goes. In fact, now we tend to slide out the bottom right just as easily as move back into the painting. And yet when the gradation reappears, we just find the direction that Levitan wanted us to go is just firmly straight back into the sculpted depth of the picture. We're going to look at two shapes here to show how carefully Levitan has modulated all the parts to fit into the whole. First, we're going to look at the little green field way at the back on the hillside. Look at how grayed that is because of atmospheric perspective. And yet if we intensify that color in that one color shape and make it more intense, it may be a more pleasing green on its own, but it now jumps away from the sense of being set back and is jumping forward from where we want it to be. And then when it gradates back, we can just see it falls back into place, back in the distance. The other thing I wanted to look at is that little bush down in the bottom right-hand corner that was deflecting our eye through the painting we were noticing before. But if you just look at the painting as a whole and you see that, it just has a very quiet role to play. But if we intensify the color of it, as it becomes intensified, if we just look at the whole painting, we can see that our eye now is getting distracted and pulled to that one part at the expense of the whole painting. And then as the color comes back to the way Levitan painted it, again our attention is just brought around the painting rather than distracted by that one part. And so in a good composition, each part is made to work in the context of the whole. The second painting we're going to look at is by the Russian Nikolai Timkov. It's a wonderful example of how he has modulated all the various parts to work so beautifully as a whole. He didn't walk around for days looking for something this balanced and harmonious. He saw it, he felt the idea, and then he imposed that idea on the landscape. He improved on it so that the composition, which was suggested by nature, was just pulled together. And we're going to look at various examples of what he's done here to make it work so effectively. First off, we're obviously entering the painting along this road at the bottom. And look at how beautifully he's modulated the grays and the greens in the foreground to create such a rich variety of hue with very small changes in value and intensity. So it doesn't distract our eye. It's rich, but it isn't distracting. And we're pulled back into the painting along the road to the wheat field, to the edge of the wheat field, which just stops our attention, and then we start sliding over to the left along the dark mass of trees up to that rich variety of purple buildings, and then across the trees, softened along the edge of the horizon, softened by atmospheric perspective, so that they sit way into the distance, and we're pulled right back to the stand of trees on the far right-hand side, which stops our eye, and then we notice that little slight line of darker wheat that pulls our eye back into the edge of the wheat field, right back into the painting. As I did with the last painting by Levitan, I'm going to make changes to the painting. And as you follow these examples, it's important to notice how your eye moves innocently on the picture plane as the changes are made. This will help you when you look at your own paintings of how your eye is really being moved in your composition, not what you hope it's doing. And this one skill will dramatically improve your painting. The first change we'll look at is the strong gradation in the bottom right that Timkov uses to push us into the painting. By eliminating that gradation, the eye slides right out of the bottom right. The convention of using gradations like this to move our eye has been used by artists for hundreds of years. We don't need to reinvent the wheel in developing better, more effective compositions. That gradation is just moving us into the painting. The second shape we'll look at is the stand of trees on the horizon on the far right-hand side. You see what happens when we increase their value, how our attention is now led out of the picture plane, out of the composition on the right-hand side. And when it's returned to its original value, we can see how our eye is again attracted to that line in the wheat field, and again we're pulled into the painting. Thirdly, we'll look at the edge of the wheat field. Look what happens when we darken the value of that. Now our eye is stopped by it. We don't travel back into the picture. It forms a barrier. If we gradate the edge of that wheat field so that it's darker on the right, you can see it acts as an arrow. It pulls us off to the right and out of the painting. If we gradate it to the left, it pulls us into the painting as Timkov planned, but it's too forceful. As he planned it, it's a subtle shape to lead us across the composition over to those trees. In this painting by Dennis Miller Bunker, a contemporary of Sargent, how does your eye move? Obviously there's a strong sweep around the edge of the water past the boat and the small tree that moves right over to the right-hand side of the painting. Plus there's the dark mass of the trees, simpler on the left and more complex on the right, that pulls us into the painting. This all leads to the little boat and then to the tree on the right, which stops our eye from continuing out of the painting. Its reflection heads us back down to the large clump of weeds in the foreground. Next, I want to show you how detail can be distracting. Bunker simplified the dark masses of trees to be a design element that works for him. Look what happens if we introduce the kind of complex edges of leaves and of sky holes that would have been there when he actually painted. You see how distracting it is? And yet, when we return to how he had it, we again experience trees as a functional design element in the composition. Bunker has pushed his idea. He's imposed design to his purpose. Let's eliminate the small tree in the far right-hand side, and you'll see how the attention is just left hanging in the background and even slides out of the right-hand side of the painting. But with that little tree, our attention is again directed down the edge of the picture plane back into the painting. This is a very tonal painting. If we exaggerate the intensity of color of one of the parts in the composition, you can see now how our attention is dragged back left rather than continuing around to the right. It arrests our attention from the movement we were just talking about. This painting is keyed to be very tonal, so more intense color isn't appropriate. That one color might be more appealing if you like vibrant color, but in the context of the whole composition, it's clearly disruptive. Color has to work relative to the whole. And finally, I'd like you to look at the beautiful balance of these four shapes, as if they exist in space on the edge of a huge circle. We've looked at three landscapes. Let's look at a still life by Chardin. Notice the major horizontal and vertical he uses to anchor the composition to the picture plane. He moves us up into the painting and back down into his center of interest where he has the hardest edges and the greatest contrasts. If we darken the background around the white bowl on the right, you can see how it pulls our attention over to that edge too forcefully. As with the highlights on the fish's head, which if too bright, pulls our attention up distracted to the top of the painting. When we talk of moving the eye around the picture plane, something to watch out for is creating eye traps. That is, our eye is moved into but can't get out of a spot in the composition. It could be right where we want to lead the eye, or inadvertently somewhere else. We want to guide where the eye is moving. Keep it interested and moving about the picture plane, not getting it trapped in one spot and static. This example shows the usefulness of gradation to move the eye. The tower on the hillside is where our attention goes, but clearly the gradation takes us off to the left and back around the composition. A gradation is a very useful tool to move your eye through a major compositional mass. But note that your eye moves from darker to lighter, as this example makes clear. A final thing is when you have a road or river or something moving back into the landscape, you'll find the feeling of movement or structure is stronger if you use straight lines and angles rather than just long, loopy curves. If you really look at a road or a river going back into the landscape, you'll find that it actually is moving in a series of straight segments. So let's get started. First thing I wanted to show you is some viewfinders. When you're out, actually even if you're in the studio, but when you're out in the landscape, there's so much information that you want to be able to isolate it and isolate those abstract shapes. And a viewfinder is a really important tool for that. This one here is taking three standard sizes and dividing them into thirds. And these lines are really useful things to move major elements of the composition up to, particularly creating centers of interest in these four spots. This here, the red, what it does is it neutralizes color so that it's easier to figure out what the values are without getting distracted by the brilliance of the color. So this is a very good one. There's another one here which is easy to use in the sense that it's so small, but it goes from everything from the narrowest composition right up the square. And it also has a hole here against the neutral gray in order to be testing colors. Now the third possibility, if you're out and about and not with that viewfinder, is just to use your fingers. And you can just do something like that and bringing them up to your eye like this and just getting them, depending on how far and how close you have them, just blocking off what you want to see. Because these four lines here, 1, 2, 3, and 4, where you place them on the landscape are the four most important lines on the composition. And it'll make all the difference about how the painting is going to turn out. A very useful way to divide the picture plane to build a composition is to divide it in thirds. By lining major masses against one or two of those thirds, and by putting the center of interest around one of those intersections, we create irregular rather than symmetric design. It's amazing without this how easy it is to put things right in the middle, very static and usually uninteresting. If you look at a book of paintings you like, you will find that artists often line things up like this in painting after painting because it just feels right intuitively. In the first photograph, look what happens when we digitize the color masses on the computer, creating simpler color masses. And then we have a sketch of how those masses might be arranged in a thumbnail in preparation to paint. It's like the value of squinting, of simplifying the masses to reduce the detail and to see them more in their painted masses. We can find different ways to crop this image to make good. In terms of detail, but masses. Masses of differing contrast. Notice here the contrast is subtle, close in value and intensity we have for painting. So emphasizing contrasts where we want the eye to go and de-emphasizing contrasts where we don't is about as fundamental an idea in making. We'll take another landscape. We'll see how by cropping it we make it more intense, more interesting. And then we'll see an interpretation I did of it, including obviously elements that weren't in the original landscape to make it more dramatic. Here again, we'll show two croppings that both are interesting as paintings, and then to see this digitized version that we can see as color. Paint that with marks of paint, again, like squinting, to reduce the detail, to simplify it. So we look to get away from whether we're doing landscape, figures, interiors, still life, arranging the major abstract masses within the four lines of your picture plane is going to be your foundation. Trees or a latticed porch, which isn't that it's impossible to paint or even maybe that it's a good composition, but it's so hard to see abstractly in terms of shapes and masses. The tendency is to get overwhelmed by the detail. Look for compositions where you can see how the brush marks will translate into the objects you're looking at. One thing that should be apparent now, three simple ones there, a mass, the dark is a mass, this whole thing reads as a mass moving this way, another slightly foreground one, another one here, and then this whole one kind of reads as one in there. So it's actually pretty simple, although you could obviously you could keep going, adding branches and leaves and twigs. You could do it for months and just get it incredibly detailed. It's not going to help you if this section, this place in the making of a painting isn't working. Now, I'm going to start going forward here, and I want to make sure I'm going to get a few things going on here. Definitely I need to make sure this thing comes up in front of that. What I want to get now is a few things in here in a peripheral way that says, okay, there's vegetation of various kinds going on here, but I'm going to put a little bit of more attention here so we wrap